Well, I don't know if I'm going to be much more cheerful. Hopefully Jan can cheer us up at the end. I think this question that Triata raises about why is it safe for Democrats to be proposing cuts to SNAP right now is an incredibly important one, and one that I hope to address a little bit, because I think, and thank you so much for that, because that was really helpful, and that meals metric is a very helpful way of thinking about it. I've often thought the pounds thing did not make sense.
Crazy.
So I'd like to sort of talk about that, and because I think one of the things that we're seeing is that some of the proposals that are happening in Congress right now are in many ways coming out of what happened in welfare reform in 1996, the way it was applied to the food stamp program, but it's also, in many ways, the arguments are falling along the same lines. And so I think what we really, and it was safe at that time for Democrats to cut welfare as we knew it. And so I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from what happened in 1996, and I think we really need to be thinking about that in thinking about how to address these proposed cuts to SNAP. And even, I'm happy to hear, I didn't realize that there was a bill to restore the cuts that just happened, and clearly that's where I'm assuming most people in this room would like to go. There have been some good proposals in terms of Gillibrand's proposal to raise the benefit level from the thrifty food plan to the low cost food plan. So it's not as if those proposals aren't being made, but right now there isn't enough sort of political clout behind them to make them something that at least the Democrats feel like they have to do. And I think that's where we really need to focus. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is, as Jan said, I'm an anthropologist and I've been doing research on food policy in New York City. And one of the serendipitous things that happened over the course of my research is, as these proposals started coming up in the House, I realized some of the things that they're proposing, specifically around work requirements, have already been done and have been done continuously in New York City all throughout the recession. So New York's a little bit of a test case in some ways for what would happen if some of these proposals around work requirements went through at the national level. So I think, one of the things that we have to understand is what's happening with the food stamp program since 1996 and essentially what they're trying to do right now, specifically the Republicans, but I think this is kind of safe on both sides of the aisle, is to transform the SNAP program from what originally was a fairly robust program that protected the right to food in the U.S. to what is now being framed often, and you hear people talk about this, the Bloomberg Administration says this all the time, that the food stamp program, they want to think of it as a work support or as a subsidy to low-wage labor. And I think that is one of the reasons why, the growth that we've seen in the food stamp program nationally and in New York City has raised a lot of eyebrows. In New York City, since Bloomberg took office, the rolls have gone up 120%. And that's something that he touts as an accomplishment, which is very different from Giuliani. And after 96, the food stamp rolls plummeted along with the cash assistance rolls. I think they dropped something like 45%. The food stamp rolls dropped 45% between 1996 and 2001. So suddenly, to be bragging about the food stamp rolls increasing 120% makes you wonder what is the thinking behind this. And I think part of it is that there's been a reformulation, and actually Commissioner Doer told me this when I cornered him one day, that there has been a redefining of food stamps around this idea of work supports. And I heard welfare administrators tell me this over and over, that they want working people to get food stamps, that this is a benefit that working people deserve. The problem with this is that the policy when it comes to non-working people, people who are unemployed, is very, very different. So one of the things that I was doing in my research, I worked in a food pantry in Brooklyn, and essentially I set up a food stamp outreach program for them. So I was helping people apply. I was going to the welfare office with them. If they had problems with their cases, I was helping them try to sort them out with the welfare office. And then I was also interviewing them, and I was interviewing them about their work histories, about what the barriers to eating well were, and also about their experiences applying for benefits, what benefits they were getting, their history of benefits. And what became very, very clear to me was that people who are working on the books, who have a job, say, making minimum wage, who get a pay stub, it's fairly easy to apply for food stamps. They've made it much easier, and this is something, that the Bloomberg administration has been very proud of. If you can go into the office and you can show them, I work this many hours and I get paid this much, it's not hard to get food stamps. I mean, it's not easy, but it's not bureaucratically as difficult as when you go in, and especially if you're applying for cash assistance, it's incredibly difficult to get also food stamp benefits and maintain those benefits, and if you're unemployed. Because one of the things that the Bloomberg administration has done is, in some ways, although they've eased the application process for the working poor, and I put that in quotes because, everyone's working, but though they've eased restrictions for the working poor, the Giuliani policy of diverting people from cash assistance, from making the cash assistance program incredibly punitive and difficult, have all stayed in place and haven't changed. So what you have essentially when it comes to the food stamp program in New York City is a little bit of a tiered system, right? Where it's much easier for some people and much more difficult for others. And so I want to talk about this a little bit because I think one of the things that there's been some research coming out that's showing that poverty at the very bottom of the economic spectrum has really intensified considerably. There was just a study recently in the past year or two on the number of people living on the World Bank measure of $2 a day. And that number in the U.S. has increased 130% since 1996. So when we talk about the impact of welfare reform, the impact has really been on the intensification of really at the bottom of the income scale. People not being able to access cash, but also people who are trying to access cash assistance because they're unemployed, not even being able to access other benefits like food stamps. And I'll get to some more concrete examples on that in a second. At the same time, overall welfare spending has actually increased. And this is where you get this argument from the Republicans. And there's a lot of right-wing think tanks who have been making a very big deal about these numbers. Welfare spending in the U.S. has actually increased since 1996. The question is, who is it benefiting and who is it going to? The very, very poor, people who are unemployed, people who are out of work, are being left out in the cold. At the same time, programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit has really expanded a lot. And this is a good thing. People need those benefits. The food stamp program obviously has expanded quite a lot. That spending has gone up. But it's benefiting this sort of redefined deserving poor. And the deserving poor are people who are working for incredibly low wages. I mean, the other problem we have is a stagnating minimum wage, where people who are earning very low wages are really earning wages that are below the subsistence level, right? So what's happened is there's been a lot of shifting in the welfare state in terms of who it's benefiting, and it's intensifying poverty at this very sort of at the bottom level. So one of the things that we see is that it's been incredibly difficult to actually cut government spending on welfare programs. I mean, they have been fairly durable in terms of spending dollars. What's happened, though, is that there's been incremental changes in these programs through minor policy shifts that happen over time that become very cumulative. And, people who, I'm sure Triada knows, she's nodding her head because she knows what I'm talking about. It's these tiny changes that happen over time that can happen really with very little oversight because they're not happening in big national legislation that really shape these programs and very much shape the experience of poverty. And so in my research, this is what I've been seeing is the cumulative effect of a lot of these changes. So I just want to talk about this real briefly. a lot of the debate right now in Congress is over this idea of able-bodied adults without dependents. And this is where, in the House bill, about $20 billion of the $40 billion in proposed cuts is coming from. So this also has its historical roots in welfare reform in '96. At that time, in the passage of welfare reform, there was an effort to block grant food stamps along with welfare, to sort of devolve it to the states and to cap funding. And Clinton, to his credit, vetoed several versions of the welfare reform bill in order to maintain SNAP, then food stamps, as a federal entitlement, which is one of the reasons why it's been able to grow the way it has today. But at the time, because this was sort of a negotiation, one of the things that was added was a work requirement that bars, this is the able-bodied adults without dependents. So these are childless adults who are between the ages of 18 and 50 who are not disabled. But they also, Congress inserted a waiver for states with high unemployment rates, and these waivers were meant to protect unemployed people in times of economic crisis, like what we're dealing with right now, and have really benefited millions of Americans who lost their jobs during the recession. And this category, the able-bodied adult without dependents, was the fastest growing category of SNAP recipients through the recession. New York City, I'm not proud to say, actually never accepted these waivers. So part of the Recovery Act was to extend these waivers to all states because the unemployment rate was so high nationally. All of the states took them. I think all of the states took them, maybe with one exception. And New York State took the waiver to the work requirements, but Bloomberg did not. And this is a long-standing history between New York City and their welfare policy and New York State, and not necessarily agreeing. We all saw this with the fingerprinting of food stamps, where Cuomo had to go over Bloomberg's head to get rid of it. In some ways, this kind of makes New York City an interesting case for what would happen if the House Republicans are actually able to get this waiver proposal through, which, who knows? I don't actually know. But what I want to say is that one of the dangers of this is that what we're seeing on the national level is a kind of repeat of what's happened in New York City, which is an attempt to actually, on the national level, recreate what's happened in New York, where we have a sort of two-tiered food stamp system, where food stamps become much more along the lines of the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a benefit that, if you can prove you're working, becomes a fairly easy benefit to get, and if you're not working, becomes very difficult. Probably the best sort of example of this is when you look in New York City at the people who are applying for cash assistance and their experience with trying to maintain their food stamp cases. And this is something that I documented extensively in my research. And I think when we talk about the administrative barriers to SNAP, Smita Narula's excellent study that just came out does a very good job of outlining some of this. But what often isn't talked about is the difficulties that unemployed people have trying to access SNAP benefits. So families who try to access cash assistance in New York are routinely cut off from their food stamp benefits for failure to comply with work requirements. I think if we saw work requirements extended to food stamp only cases, we would see a huge number of those people being sanctioned for missing a single appointment. If you can't get childcare and you can't make the appointment, they instantly just cut you off from your benefits. We're seeing that with cash assistance. We've seen it for a long time. I think if they extend these work requirements to SNAP, we'll see the same thing. The other thing is that when people get sanctioned, those sanctions are typically durational. They set them for a period of time. So in New York, families can get cut off of a portion of their food stamp benefits for up to 6 months, which means that you can't even reapply during that time. Now, in New York, it's not a full family sanction, it's just the adult portion, but still, you're still talking about managing, say, on a food stamp, instead of a food stamp budget for 4 people, a food stamp budget for 2 people, right, if it's 2 adults and 2 children. And also, people are forced to, of course, perform these work requirements, these work assignments for their food stamp benefits. So they're essentially being asked to work for food. And that's what the danger of these House Republican proposals is that we're really talking about, I think Joe Saw said this, the welfareization of the food stamp program. And I just think that we need to sort of note that because it's incredibly dangerous. That even if we were to, for example, increase food stamp benefits, if we can't kind of root out some of this legacy of the welfare reforms in '96 and these divisions between the deserving and the working or the undeserving, and not move more towards a real right to food, to restore the program to what it was when it was originally formulated, I think that needs to also be part of our thinking in addition to just fighting the cuts.
Okay.